For the NASDAQ, you can see that it's in the red, down slightly. It has pared its losses, but the tech-heavy NASDAQ is being weighed on by tech. In fact, the tech sector is really one of the big drags for the markets overall today. We're talking about Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. In fact, Facebook on the month is now down about 11% for its worst month since November of 2014. So really some big drags here in technology. Many of these names have been down 4 out of the last 4 days. And according to Blake Harper over at Loop Capital, he's saying that this weakness in tech could reflect uncertainty around what a protectionist policy under the Trump administration could mean for these companies with large international exposure. As for what's working today, the winners, we're looking at the banks. The rally in banks continues. We are looking at Bank of America, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup all trading higher 4 days in a row. In fact, Bank of America has had its best 4-day gain since 2008, trading at levels last seen in November of 2008. And JP Morgan is on pace to finish at a record high. So big strength here in the banks. One reason why, both of you talked about it just moments ago, the rally in rates. We do have the 2-year, 10-year, and 30-year all trading higher. And this, of course, as bonds sell off, rates trade inverse to price. And this, too, could reflect expectations around the Trump administration. In fact, last week, Edward Millis at FBR said that he believes that this big rally in rates could reflect uncertainty around Fed leadership and what policy could look like in the future. But with the 10-year yield back at levels seen early in January, could this continue? Could the spike in yield continue? We go into some Bloomberg and we take a look at G#, BTV 4930. We see the 10-year yield on top in white starting to really pop up there. And on bottom, we have the RSI, or the Relative Strength Index. And we see that it's circled over there to the side of the chart at levels last seen in 2008, suggesting that the 10-year yield at this point, that this rally is oversold, with that inverse relationship making it oversold. But basically that we could see rates come back in to some degree.
Thanks so much, Abigail. Appreciate it. And it looks like President Obama is now beginning that press conference. Let's listen in.
On my final foreign trip as president. And while we're abroad, I'll have a chance to take a few of your questions, but I figured why wait? I know that there's a lot of domestic issues that people are thinking about, so I wanted to see if I could clear out some of the underbrush so that when we're overseas and people are asking about foreign policy questions, people don't feel obliged to tack on 3 other questions to them. Let me, I know you still will, yes. That I'm aware, but I'm trying something out here. First of all, let me mention 3 brief topics. First of all, as I discussed with the President-elect on Thursday, my team stands ready to accelerate in the next steps that are required to ensure a smooth transition. And we are going to be staying in touch as we travel. I remember what it was like when I came in 8 years ago. It is a big challenge. This office is bigger than any one person, and that's why ensuring a smooth transition is so important. It's not something that the Constitution explicitly requires, but it is one of those norms that are vital to a functioning democracy, similar to norms of civility and tolerance and a commitment to reason and facts and analysis. It's part of what makes this country work. And as long as I'm president, we are going to uphold those norms and cherish and uphold those ideals. As I've told my staff, we should be very proud that their work has already ensured that when we turn over the keys, the car is in pretty good shape. We are indisputably in a stronger position today than we were when I came in 8 years ago. Jobs have been growing for 73 straight months. Incomes are rising. Poverty is falling. The uninsured rate is at the lowest level on record. Carbon emissions have come down without impinging on our growth. And so my instructions to my team are that we run through the tape. We make sure that we finish what we started, that we don't let up in these last couple of months, because my goal is on January 21st, America's in the strongest position possible, and hopefully there's an opportunity for the next president to build on that. Number 2, our work has also helped to stabilize the global economy, and because there is one president at a time, I'll spend this week reinforcing America's support for the approaches that we've taken to promote economic growth and global security on a range of issues. I look forward to my first visit in Greece. And then in Germany, I'll visit with Chancellor Merkel, who's probably been my closest international partner these past 8 years. I'll also signal our solidarity with our closest allies and express our support for a strong, integrated, and united Europe. It's essential to our national security, and it's essential to global stability. And that's why the Transatlantic Alliance and the NATO alliance have endured for decades under Democratic and Republican administrations. Finally, in Peru, I'll meet with the leaders of countries that have been the focus of our foreign policy through our rebalance in the Asia-Pacific. This is a time of great change in the world, but America's always been a pillar of strength and a beacon of hope to peoples around the globe, and that's what it must continue to be. Finally, on a personal note, Michelle and I want to offer our deepest condolences to Gwen Eifel's family and all of you, her colleagues, on her passing. Gwen was a friend of ours. She was an extraordinary journalist. She always kept faith with the fundamental responsibilities of her profession, asking tough questions, holding people in power accountable, and defending a strong and free press that makes our democracy work. I always appreciated Gwen's reporting, even when I was at the receiving end of one of her tough and thorough interviews. Whether she reported from a convention floor or from the field, whether she sat at the debate moderator's table or at the anchor's desk, she not only informed today's citizens, but she also inspired tomorrow's journalists. She was an especially powerful role model for young women and girls who admired her integrity, her tenacity, and her intellect, and for whom she blazed a trail as one half of the first all-female anchor team on network news. So Gwen did her country a great service. Michelle and I join her family and her colleagues and everybody else who loved her in remembering her fondly today. So with that, I'm going to take some questions, and because Josh Earnest has some pull around here, he just happened to put at the top of the list, Colleen Nelson of the Wall Street Journal. My understanding is, Colleen, that this is wrapping up your stint here, and you're going to Kansas City. Josh just happens to be from Kansas City. So I didn't know if there was any coincidence there, but we wish you the very best of luck in your new endeavors.
As it turns out, there's no place like home.
There you go.
You're about to embark on your final foreign trip. What will you say to other world leaders about your successor? They've expressed many of the same misgivings that you have about Donald Trump. Should they be worried about the future of U.S. foreign policy? And separately, as Democrats scramble to regroup after a pretty shocking upset, what is your advice about where the party goes now and who should lead your party?
One of the great things about the United States is that when it comes to world affairs, the president obviously is the leader of the executive branch, the commander-in-chief, the spokesperson for the nation. But the influence and the work that we have is the result not just of the president. It is the result of countless interactions and arrangements and relationships between our military and other militaries, and our diplomats and other diplomats, and intelligence officers and development workers. And there is enormous continuity beneath the day-to-day news that makes us that indispensable nation when it comes to maintaining order and promoting prosperity around the world. That will continue. In my conversation with the president-elect, he expressed a great interest in maintaining our core strategic relationships. And so one of the messages I will be able to deliver is his commitment to NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance. I think that's one of the most important functions I can serve at this stage during this trip, is to let them know that there is no weakening of resolve when it comes to America's commitment to maintaining a strong and robust NATO relationship, and a recognition that those alliances aren't just good for Europe, they're good for the United States, and they're vital for the world. With respect to the Democratic Party, look, as I said in the Rose Garden right after the election, when your team loses, everybody gets deflated, and it's hard, and it's challenging. And so I think it's a healthy thing for the Democratic Party to go through some reflection. You know, I think it's important for me not to be bigfooting that conversation. I think we want to see new voices and new ideas emerge. That's part of the reason why I think term limits are a really useful thing. I think the Democrats should not waver on our core beliefs and principles. The belief that we should have an economy that works for everybody, not just a few. The belief that America, at its best, is inclusive and not exclusive. That we insist on the dignity and God-given potential and worth of every child, regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation or what zip code they were born in. That we are committed to a world in which we keep America safe, but we recognize that our power doesn't just flow from our extraordinary military, it also flows from the strength of our ideals and our principles and our values. So there are going to be a core set of values that shouldn't be up for debate, should be our North Star. But how we organize politically, I think, is something that we should spend some time thinking about. I believe that we have better ideas. But I also believe that good ideas don't matter if people don't hear them. And one of the issues that Democrats have to be clear on is that given population distribution across the country, we have to compete everywhere. We have to show up everywhere. We have to work at a grassroots level, something that's been a running thread in my career. You know, I won Iowa not because the demographics dictated that I would win Iowa. It was because I spent 87 days going to every small town and fair and fish fry and VFW hall. And there were some counties where I might have lost, but maybe I lost by 20 points instead of 50 points. There's some counties maybe I won that people didn't expect because people had a chance to see you and listen to you and get a sense of who you stood for and who you were fighting for. And the challenge for a national party is how do you dig in there and create those kinds of structures so that people have a sense of what it is that you stand for. And that increasingly is difficult to do just through a national press strategy. It's increasingly difficult to do because of the splintering of the press. And so I think the discussions that have been taking place about how do you build more grassroots organizing, how do you build up state parties and local parties and school board elections you're paying attention to, and state rep races and city council races, that all, I think, will contribute to stronger outcomes in the future. And I'm optimistic that will happen. You know, for Democrats who are feeling completely discouraged, I've been trying to remind them, everybody remembers my Boston speech in 2004. They may not remember me showing up here in 2005 when John Kerry had lost a close election. Tom Daschle, the leader of the Senate, had been beaten in an upset. Ken Salazar and I were the only two Democrats that won nationally. Republicans controlled the Senate and the House. And 2 years later, Democrats were winning back Congress, and 4 years later I was president of the United States. Things change pretty rapidly. But they don't change inevitably. They change because you work for it. Nobody said democracy is supposed to be easy. It's hard. And in a big country like this, it probably should be hard. Mark Knoller.
Thank you, sir.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Mr. President, what can you tell us about the learning curve on becoming president? Can you tell us how long it took you before you were fully at ease in the job, if that ever happens? And did you discuss this matter with President-elect Trump?
About a week ago, I started feeling pretty good, but no. I think the learning curve always continues. This is a remarkable job. It is like no other job on earth. And it is a constant flow of information and challenges and issues. That is truer now than it has ever been, partly because of the nature of information and the interconnection between regions of the world. If you were president 50 years ago, the tragedy in Syria might not even penetrate what the American people were thinking about on a day-to-day basis. Today, they're seeing vivid images of a child in the aftermath of a bombing. There was a time when, if you had a financial crisis in Southeast Asia somewhere, it had no impact on our markets. Today, it does. So the amount of information, the amount of incoming that any administration has to deal with today and respond to much more rapidly than ever before, that makes it different. I was watching a documentary that during the Bay of Pigs crisis, JFK had about 2 weeks before anybody reported on it. Imagine that. I think it's fair to say that if something like that happens under a current president, they got to figure out in about an hour what their response is. So these are the kinds of points that I shared with the president-elect. It was a free-flowing and I think useful conversation. I hope it was. I tried to be as honest as I could about the things I think any president coming in needs to think about. And probably the most important point that I made was that how you staff, particularly your chief of staff, your national security advisor, your White House counsel, how you set up a process and a system to surface information, generate options for a president, understanding that ultimately the president's going to be the final decision maker, that's something that has to be attended to right away. I have been blessed by having, and I admittedly am biased, some of the smartest, hardest working, good people in my administration that I think any president's ever had. And as a consequence of that team, I've been able to make good decisions. And if you don't have that around you, then you'll get swamped. So I hope that he appreciated that advice. What I also discussed was the fact that I had been encouraged by his statements on election night about the need for unity and his interest in being the president for all people, and that how he staffs, the first steps he takes, the first impressions he makes, the reset that can happen after an election, all those things are important and should be thought about. And I think it's important to give him the room and the space to do that. It takes time to put that together. But I emphasized to him that, look, in an election like this that was so hotly contested and so divided, gestures matter, and how he reaches out to groups that may not have supported him, how he signals his interest in their issues or concerns. I think those are the kinds of things that can set a tone that will help move things forward once he's actually taken office.
And how long did it take before you were at ease in the job?
Well, I didn't really have time to worry about being at ease because you'll recall we were losing about 800,000 jobs a month. So the good news is that in some ways my experience is atypical. It's hard to find an analogous situation. By the time FDR came into office, the Depression had been going on for a couple of years. We were in the midst of a free fall. Financial system was locking up. The auto industry was about to go belly up. The housing market had entirely collapsed. One of the advantages that I had was that I was too busy to worry about how acclimated I was feeling in the job. We just had to make a bunch of decisions. In this situation, we're turning over a country that has challenges, has problems, and obviously there are people out there who are feeling deeply disaffected. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the results that we had in the election. On the other hand, if you look at the basic indicators of where the country is right now, the unemployment rate is as low as it's been in 8-9 years. Incomes and wages have both gone up over the last year faster than they have in a decade or two. We've got historically low uninsured rates. The financial systems are stable. The stock market is hovering around its all-time high, and 401ks have been restored. The housing market has recovered. We have challenges internationally, but our most immediate challenge with respect to ISIL, we're seeing significant progress in Iraq, and Mosul is now increasingly being retaken by Iraqi security forces supported by us. Our alliances are in strong shape. The progress we've made with respect to carbon emissions has been greater than any country on earth, and gas is $2 a gallon. So he will have time and space, I think, to make judicious decisions. The incoming administration doesn't have to put out a huge number of fires. They may want to take the country in a significantly different direction. But they've got time to consider what exactly they want to achieve, and that's a testament to the tremendous work that my team's done over the last 8 years. I'm very proud of them for it. Athena Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. You said more than once that you did not believe that Donald Trump would ever be elected president and that you thought he was unfit for the office. Now that you've spent time with him, sitting down and talking to him for an hour and a half in the Oval Office, do you now think that President-elect Trump is qualified to be president? And if I can do a compound question, the other one is you mentioned staffing and tone. What do you say to those Americans who may not doubt that there will be a peaceful transition, but that are concerned about some of the policies and sentiments either expressed by President-elect Trump himself or his supporters that may seem hostile to minorities and others? Specifically, I'm talking about the announcement that Steve Bannon, who is a proponent of the so-called alt-right movement, what many call the white nationalist movement, is going to have a prominent role in the White House under President Trump as his chief strategist and senior advisor. What message does that send to the country and to the world?
Okay. Athena, without copping out, I think it's fair to say that it would not be appropriate for me to comment on every appointment that the President-elect starts making if I want to be consistent with the notion that we're going to try to facilitate a smooth transition. Look, the people have spoken. Donald Trump will be the next president, the 45th president of the United States. And it will be up to him to set up a team that he thinks will serve him well and reflect his policies. And those who didn't vote for him have to recognize that that's how democracy works. That's how this system operates. When I won, there were a number of people who didn't like me and didn't like what I stood for. And, you know, I think that whenever you've got an incoming president of the other side, particularly in a bitter election like this, it takes a while for people to reconcile themselves with that new reality. Hopefully it's a reminder that elections matter and voting counts. And so, you know, I don't know how many times we have to relearn this lesson, because we ended up having 43% of the country not voting who were eligible to vote, but it makes a difference. So, given that President-elect Trump is now trying to balance what he said in the campaign and the commitments he made to his supporters with working with those who disagreed with him and members of Congress and reaching out to constituencies that didn't vote for him, I think it's important for us to let him make his decisions. And I think the American people will judge over the course of the next couple of years whether they like what they see and whether these are the kinds of policies and this is the direction that they want to see the country going. And my role is to make sure that when I hand off this White House, that it is in the best possible shape, and that I've been as helpful as I can to him in going forward and building on the progress that we've made. You know, and my advice, as I said to the president-elect when we had our discussions, was that campaigning is different from governing. I think he recognizes that. I think he's sincere in wanting to be a successful president and moving this country forward. And I don't think any president ever comes in saying to himself, I want to figure out how to make people angry or alienate half the country. I think he's going to try as best he can to make sure that he delivers, not only for the people who voted for him, but for the people at large. And the good thing is that there are going to be elections coming up, so there's a built-in incentive for him to try to do that. You know, it's only been 6 days, and I think it'll be important for him to have the room to staff up, to figure out what his priorities are, to be able to distinguish between what he was campaigning on and what is practical, what he can actually achieve. You know, there are certain things that make for good sound bites, but don't always translate into good policy. You know, that's something that he and his team, I think, will wrestle with in the same way that every president wrestles with. I did say to him, as I've said publicly, that because of the nature of the campaigns and the bitterness and ferocity of the campaigns, that it's really important to try to send some signals of unity and to reach out to minority groups or women or others that were concerned about the tenor of the campaign. And I think, you know, that's something that he will want to do. But this is all happening real fast. He's got commitments to supporters that helped to get him here, and he's going to have to balance those. Over the coming weeks and months and years, my hope is that those impulses ultimately win out. But it's a little too early to start making judgments on that.
Your views about qualifications, has that changed after meeting with them?
And you're watching President Obama speaking in the Brady press briefing room at the White House. He's now answering questions about the administration's transition to President-elect Donald Trump. We want to welcome to our viewers live on Twitter. Markets have just closed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average finishing at a record high. Let's go back to the president at the White House.
Regardless of what experience or assumptions he brought to the office, this office has a way of waking you up. And those aspects of his positions or predispositions that don't match up with reality, he will find shaken up pretty quick, because reality has a way of asserting itself. And some of his gifts that obviously allowed him to execute one of the biggest political upsets in history, those are ones that hopefully he will put to good use on behalf of all the American people. Scott Horsley.
Thank you, Mr. President. You're off to Europe, which is facing some of the same populist pressures we see at work in this country. When you spoke at the UN, you talked about the choice they're facing between integration and building walls.
Right.
What choice do you think the American people made last week? And is there still a chance for what you call a course correction before Europeans make some of their choices?
I think the American people recognize that the world has shrunk, that it's interconnected, that you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. The American people recognize that their careers or their kids' careers are going to have to be more dynamic, that they might not be working at a single plant for 30 years, but they might have to change careers. They might have to get more education. They might have to retool or retrain. And I think the American people are game for that. They want to make sure that the rules of the game are fair. And what that means is that if you look at surveys around Americans' attitudes on trade, the majority of the American people still support trade. But they're concerned about whether or not trade is fair and whether we've got the same access to other countries' markets as they have with us. Is there just a race to the bottom when it comes to wages and so forth? Now, I made an argument, thus far unsuccessfully, that the trade deal we had organized, TPP, did exactly that it strengthened workers' rights and environmental rights, leveled the playing field, and as a consequence would be good for American workers and American businesses. But that's a complex argument to make when people remember plants closing and jobs being offshore. So part of what I think this election reflected was people wanting that course correction that you described, and the message around stopping surges of immigration, not creating new trade deals that may be unfair. I think those were themes that played a prominent role in the campaign. As we now shift to governing, my argument is that we do need to make sure that we have an orderly, lawful immigration process, but that if it is orderly and lawful, immigration is good for our economy. It keeps this country young, it keeps it dynamic, We have entrepreneurs and strivers who come here and are willing to take risks, and that's part of the reason why America historically has been successful. It's part of the reason why our economy is stronger and better positioned than most of our other competitors, is because we got a younger population that's more dynamic. When it comes to trade, I think, when you're governing, it'll become increasingly apparent that if you were to just eliminate trade deals with Mexico, for example, well, you've got a global supply chain. The parts that are allowing auto plants that were about to shut down to now employ double shifts is because they're bringing in some of those parts to assemble out of Mexico. And so it's not as simple as it might have seemed. And the key for us, when I say us, I mean Americans, but I think particularly for progressives, is to say your concerns are real, your anxieties are real. Here's how we fix them. Higher minimum wage, stronger worker protection so workers have more leverage to get a bigger piece of the pie. Stronger financial regulations, not weaker ones. Yes to trade, but trade that ensures that these other countries that trade with us aren't engaging in child labor, for example. Being attentive to inequality and not tone deaf to it, but offering prescriptions that are actually going to help folks in communities that feel forgotten. That's going to be our most important strategy, and I think we can successfully do that. People will still be looking to the United States. Our example will still carry great weight, and it continues to be my strong belief that the way we are going to make sure that everybody feels a part of this global economy is not by shutting ourselves off from each other, even if we could, but rather by working together more effectively than we have in the past. Martha Raddatz.
Thanks, Mr. President. Given some of the harsh words you had about Mr. Trump, calling him temperamentally unfit to be commander-in-chief, did anything surprise you about President-elect Trump when you met with him in your office? And also, I want to know, does anything concern you about a Trump presidency? Well,
we had a very cordial conversation, and that didn't surprise me to some degree, because I think that he is obviously a gregarious person. He's somebody who I think likes to mix it up and to have a vigorous debate. What's clear is that he was able to tap into, yes, the anxieties, but also the enthusiasm of his voters in a way that was impressive. And I said so to him, because I think that to the extent that there were a lot of folks who missed the Trump phenomenon, I think that connection that he was able to make with his supporters that was impervious to events that might have sunk another candidate, that's powerful stuff. I also think that he is coming to this office with fewer set, hard and fast policy prescriptions than a lot of other presidents might be arriving with. I don't think he is ideological. I think ultimately he's pragmatic in that way, and that can serve him well as long as he's got good people around him and he has a clear sense of direction. Do I have concerns? Absolutely. Of course I've got concerns. You know, he and I differ on a whole bunch of issues. But you know, the federal government and our democracy is not a speedboat. It's an ocean liner, as I discovered when I came into office. It took a lot of really hard work for us to make significant policy changes, even in our first 2 years when we had larger majorities than Mr. Trump will enjoy when he comes into office. And you know, one of the things I advised him to do was to make sure that before he commits to certain courses of action, he's really dug in and thought through how various issues play themselves out. I'll use a obvious example where we have a difference, but it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming year, and that's the Affordable Care Act. So obviously this has been the holy grail for Republicans over the last 6-7 years, was we got to kill Obamacare. Now, that has been taken as an article of faith, that this is terrible, it doesn't work, and we have to undo it. But now that Republicans are in charge, they got to take a look and say, let's see, we got 20 million people who have health insurance who didn't have it before. Health care costs generally have gone up at a significantly slower rate since Obamacare was passed than they did before, which has saved the federal treasury hundreds of billions of dollars. People who have health insurance are benefiting in all sorts of ways that they may not be aware of, everything from no longer having lifetime limits on the claims that they can make, to seniors getting prescription drug discounts under Medicare, to free mammograms. Now, it's one thing to characterize this thing as not working when it's just an abstraction. Now, suddenly, you're in charge and you're going to repeal it. Okay, well, what happens to those 20 million people who have health insurance? Are you going to just kick them off and suddenly they don't have health insurance? And in what ways are their lives better because of that? Are you going to repeal the provision that ensures that if you do have health insurance on your job and you lose your job, or you change jobs, or you start a small business, that you're not discriminated against because you got a pre-existing condition? That's really popular. How are you going to replace it? Are you going to change the policy that kids can stay on their parents' health insurance plan until they're 26? How are you going to approach all these issues? Now, my view is that if they can come up with something better that actually works, and a year or two after they've replaced the Affordable Care Act with their own plan, that 25 million people have health insurance and it's cheaper and better and running smoothly, I'll be the first ones to say, that's great. Congratulations. If, on the other hand, whatever they're proposing results in millions of people losing coverage and results in people who already have health insurance losing protections that were contained in the legislation, then we're going to have a problem. And I think that's not going to be unique to me. I think the American people will respond that way. So I think on a lot of issues, what you're going to see is now comes the hard part. Now is governance. We are going to be able to present to the incoming administration a country that is stronger, a federal government that is working better and more efficiently, a national security apparatus that is both more effective and truer to our values, energy policies that are resulting in not just less pollution, but also more jobs. And I think the president-elect rightly would expect that he's judged on whether we improve from that baseline and on those metrics, or things get worse. And if things get worse, then the American people will figure that out pretty quick. And if things get better, then more power to them. And I'll be the first to congratulate him.
But Mr. President, you had talked specifically about his temperament. Do you still have any concern about his temperament?
As I said, because Athena asked the question, whatever you bring to this office has a habit of magnifying and pointing out, and hopefully then you correct for it. This may seem like a silly example, but I know myself well enough to know I can't keep track of paper. I am not well organized in that way. And so pretty quickly, after I'm getting stacks of briefing books coming in every night, I say to myself, I've got to figure out a system, because I have bad filing, sorting, and organizing habits. And I've got to find some people who can help me keep track of this stuff. Now, that seems trivial, but actually it ends up being a pretty big piece of business. I think what will happen with the president-elect is there are going to be certain elements of his temperament that will not serve him well unless he recognizes them and corrects them. Because when you're a candidate and you say something that is inaccurate or controversial, it has less impact than it does when you're president of the United States. Everybody around the world's paying attention. Markets move. National security issues require a level of precision in order to make sure that you don't make mistakes. And I think he recognizes that this is different. And so do the American people. All right, I'm going to take just a couple more questions and I get out of here. Nadia Babasi.
Thank you, Mr. President. President-elect Trump threatened to unravel the Iran nuclear deal, which your administration worked very hard to achieve. What would your concern if he alters part of it, and what will your advice be, considering that he said he's open to your advice? And on Syria, sir, the Syrian regime now is threatening Aleppo with massive onslaught. You talked passionately a few years back about Benghazi, and you warned against the killing of civilians there. Many people criticize your administration for the shortcoming on the Syria policy. Are you willing to let Aleppo fall under your watch? And how do you react to President-elect Trump's statement that you won't support the Syrian opposition anymore? Thank you.
Iran is a good example of the gap, I think, between some of the rhetoric in this town, not unique to the president-elect, and the reality. I think there was a really robust debate about the merits of the Iran deal before it was completed. And I actually was pretty proud of how our democracy processed that. It was a serious debate. I think people of goodwill were on both sides of the issue. Ultimately, we were able to persuade members of Congress and the public, at least enough of them, to support it. At the time, the main argument against it was Iran wouldn't abide by the deal, that they would cheat. We now have over a year of evidence that they have abided by the agreement. That's not just my opinion. It's not just people in my administration. That's the opinion of Israeli military and intelligence officers who are part of a government that vehemently opposed the deal. So my suspicion is that when the president-elect comes in and he's consulting with his Republican colleagues on the Hill, that they will look at the facts. Because to unravel a deal that's working and preventing Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon would be hard to explain, particularly if the alternative were to have them freed from any obligations and go ahead and pursue a weapon. And keep in mind, this is not just an international agreement between us and the Iranians. This is between the P5+1, other countries, some of our closest allies. And for us to pull out would then require us to start sanctioning those other countries in Europe or China or Russia that were still abiding by the deal, because from their perspective, Iran had done what it was supposed to do. So it becomes more difficult, I think, to undo something that's working than undo something that isn't working. When you're not responsible for it, I think you can call it a terrible deal. When you are responsible for the deal and preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, you're more likely to look at the facts. That is going to be true in other circumstances. For example, the Paris Agreement. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of undoing this international agreement. Now, you've got 200 countries that have signed up for this thing. And the good news is that what we've been able to show over the last 5, 6, 8 years is that it's possible to grow the economy really fast and possible to bring down carbon emissions as well. It's not just a bunch of rules that we've set up. You've got utilities that are putting in solar panels and creating jobs. You've got the big three automakers who have seen record sales and are overachieving on the fuel efficiency standards that we set. Turns out that people like not having to fill up as often and save money at the pump, even if it's good for the environment. You've got states like California that have been moving forward on a clean energy agenda, separate and apart from any federal regulations that have been put forward. In fact, 40% of the country already lives under in states that are actively pursuing what's embodied in the Paris Agreement and the Clean Power Plant Rule. And even states like Texas that politically tend to oppose me, you've seen huge increases in wind power and solar power. And you've got some of the country's biggest companies like Google and Walmart all pursuing energy efficiency because it's good for their bottom line. So what we've been able to do is to embed a lot of these practices into how our economy works. And it's made our economy more efficient. It's helped the bottom line of folks, and it's cleaned up the environment. What the Paris Agreement now does is say to China and India and other countries that are potentially polluting, come on board. Let's work together so you guys do the same thing. And the biggest threat when it comes to climate change and pollution isn't going to come from us because we only have 300 million people. It's going to come from China with over 1 billion people and India with over 1 billion people. And if they are pursuing the same kinds of strategies that we did before we became more aware of the environment, then our kids will be choked off. And so, again, do I think that this new administration will make some changes? Absolutely. But these international agreements, the tradition has been that you carry them forward across administrations, particularly if, once you actually examine them, it turns out that they're doing good for us and binding other countries into behavior that will help us. All right, last question. Justin Sink.
Sir, on Syria.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, you're right. All right. You are right about that. With respect to Syria, in Benghazi, we had an international mandate. We had a UN security resolution. We had a broad-based coalition, and we were able to carry out a support mission that achieved the initial goal of preventing Benghazi from being slaughtered fairly quickly. It's no secret, you know this region well, that Syria is a much more messy situation with proxies coming from every direction. And so I wish that I could bring this to a halt immediately. We have made every effort to try to bring about a political resolution to this challenge. John Kerry has spent an infinite amount of time trying to negotiate with Russians and Iranians and Gulf states and other parties to try to end the killing there. But if what you're asking is, do we have the capacity to carry out the same kinds of military actions in Syria that we did in Libya, the situation is obviously different. We don't have that option easily available to us. And so we're going to have to continue to try to pursue, as best we can, a political solution, and in the interim, put as much pressure as we can to the parties to arrive at humanitarian safe spaces and ceasefires that at least alleviate the suffering that's on the ground. I recognize that that has not worked, and it is something that I continue to think about every day, and we continue to try to find some formula that would allow us to see that suffering end. But I think it's not surprising to you, because you study this deeply, that if you have a Syrian military that is committed to killing its people indiscriminately as necessary, and it is supported by Russia, that now has substantial military assets on the ground and are actively supporting that regime, and Iran actively supporting that regime, and we are supporting what has to be our #1 national security priority, which is going after ISIL, both in Mosul and ultimately in Raqqa, that the situation is not the same as it was in Libya. And obviously there are some who question the steps we took in Libya. I continue to believe that was the right thing to do, although, as I indicated before, in the aftermath of that campaign, I think the world community did not sufficiently support the need for some sort of security structures there, and it now is a situation that we have to get back into a better place. I've given you, okay. Last question is Justin Sink at Bloomberg.
Thanks, Mr. President. I wanted to ask about two things that might be on your desk over the next couple of months as you prepare for a Trump administration. One is at least 750,000 undocumented immigrants provided the federal government information about themselves and their family as part of your deferred action program. Wondering if there's anything you can do to either reassure them or shield that information from the incoming Trump administration, considering his stance on immigration. And the second is, the administration and you have long maintained that the legal restraints put on you by Congress governing movement of detainees from Gitmo are an unconstitutional infringement on your rights as Commander-in-Chief. Considering the gradual transfers that you've pursued are unlikely to continue under a Trump administration, is this now the time to sort of test that theory by moving the detainees and seeing where the chips want?
Those are both excellent questions. On the deferred action program that we have, known as DACA, that relates to Dreamers who are currently benefiting from these provisions. I will urge the President-elect and the incoming administration to think long and hard before they are endangering the status of what, for all practical purposes, are American kids. I mean, these are kids who were brought here by their parents. They did nothing wrong. They've gone to school. They have pledged allegiance to the flag. Some of them have joined the military. They've enrolled in school. By definition, if they're part of this program, they are solid, wonderful young people of good character. It is my strong belief that the majority of the American people would not want to see suddenly those kids have to start hiding again. That's something that I will encourage the President-elect to look at. With respect to Guantanamo, it is true that I have not been able to close the darn thing because of the congressional restrictions that have been placed on us. What is also true is we have greatly reduced the population. You now have significantly less than 100 people there. There are some additional transfers that may be taking place over the next 2 months. There is a group of very dangerous people that we have strong evidence of having been guilty of committing terrorist acts against the United States, but because of the nature of the evidence, in some cases, that evidence being compromised, it's very difficult to put them before a typical Article III court. And that group has always been the biggest challenge for us. My strong belief and preference is that we would be much better off closing Gitmo, moving them to a different facility that was clearly governed by U.S. jurisdiction. We'd do it a lot cheaper and just as safely. Congress disagrees with me, and I gather that the President-elect does as well. We will continue to explore options for doing that, but keep in mind that it's not just a matter of what I'm willing to do. You know, one of the things you discover about being president is that there are all these rules and norms and laws, and you got to pay attention to them. And the people who work for you are also subject to those rules and norms. And that's a piece of advice that I gave to the incoming president. I am very proud of the fact that we will, knock on wood, lead this administration without significant scandal. We've made mistakes, there have been screw-ups, but I will put the ethics of this administration and our track record in terms of just abiding by the rules and norms and keeping trust with the American people, I will put this administration against any administration in history. And the reason is because, frankly, we listened to the lawyers. You know, we had a strong White House counsel's office. We had a strong ethics office. We had people in every agency whose job it was to remind people this is how you're supposed to do things. It doesn't mean everybody always did everything exactly the way it's supposed to, because we got 2 million people working in the federal government, you know, if you're including the military, and so we had to just try to institutionalize this as much as we could, and that takes a lot of work. And one of my suggestions to the incoming president is that he take that part of the job seriously as well. Again, you wouldn't know this if you were listening to some news outlets or some members of oversight committees in Congress But if you actually look at the facts, it works. And this is just one example of the numerous ways in which the federal government is much better today than it was without people really knowing. You look at VA. People remember the legitimate problems that were publicized in Phoenix. It was scandalous what happened. What people don't remember is that we've brought in well over 1 million people who are getting benefits that weren't getting it before, driven the backlog for disability benefits way down, cut homelessness in half, just made the agency work better. Not work perfect, but work better. And one of the mottos I always have with my staff was, better is good. Perfect is unattainable. Better is possible. And so we will try to share the lessons that we've learned over these last 8 years with the incoming president. And my hope is he makes things better. And if he does, we'll all benefit from it. All right? Thank you, everybody. You guys, some of you who are traveling, you'll get a chance to ask more questions. All right? Thank you.
And that was President Obama speaking in the Brady press briefing room at the White House before he embarks on his trip to Greece, Germany, and Peru. Let's get a wrap here from our White House correspondent, Mike Dorning, who has been listening in as well. And Mike, one of the big themes that the president kept pressing on and going back to was to stress the idea that the government, the country, is better off than it was 8 years ago when he first took office.
Indeed, that's been something that he's been stressing all year long, to try to think about the arc of his presidency. You know, he started, as we all remember, right after that horrible financial crash when hundreds of thousands of people were losing their jobs every month, and where people didn't know what was going to happen when the auto companies seemed like they might fail and there might be a larger general depression. And that's a perspective that he would like people to remember about his presidency, and it helps frame up his presidency as something that works, even though it ended with an election that brought the opposition in.
Mike, it was also really interesting how diplomatic he was. Different reporters kept trying to press him and say, well, you said that Trump did not have the proper character. Two lines stood out for me. He said, this office has a way of waking you up. And he said, reality has a way of asserting itself, seeming to hint that the office could very well change Donald Trump.
Yes, I think that's partly, the hopeful, optimistic view that he's trying to portray, but also it's a note of grace that is important for the president to have toward the president-elect. No one understands the challenges better than a president in this situation, and it's important that at the very top of government that you're sending a note that, okay, this is a normal transition, let's all be normal about this. I think in his heart of hearts, he's hoping that by framing things up this way, that it will move Trump in that direction. We'll see.
We'll see. And of course, what's been interesting is in following the days after Trump's meeting with Obama, the president-elect has made various hints that he might be more flexible on Obamacare than he had been previously on the campaign trail. However, President Obama didn't actually say that when he was asked about it. He said, if anything, that if the law works or if parts of the law works, then you'd be wise to keep some of that. Why do you think there was this note of caution there, even as he heard what the president-elect has mentioned about the Affordable Care Act?
I mean, I think that he's laying out the political problem in a way that he hopes will constrain Trump, and also that will allow Democrats to stop changes. There are things that people like about Obamacare, the ban on discrimination based on pre-existing conditions above all. And he's framing up a political problem for Republicans. If you are going to repeal this, you can't have people losing their insurance, or you can't have people losing this politically popular element. And then he's probably laying out in private conversations about why it's hard not to have something that more or less looks like Obamacare if you're going to do that. Although he'd probably think, well, the best I can hope for is something that changes that into Trump care, but still hits some of the key things I wanted to do.
Mike, he wasn't asked directly about the protests that have been going around the country, but sort of the implicit message of the whole press conference was, as you say, just sort of normalize the transition, make it a smooth transition. Is there any risk in that strategy, though, however, to play the devil's advocate for a moment? Because does that sort of alienate the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party who does not want a Trump presidency normalized?
I don't think so. I think when you're the president, you can't be the one who's throwing bombs, throwing Molotov cocktails on this. It's the job of people like Chuck Schumer, like Nancy Pelosi, like Harry Reid. The congressional Democrats are going to stay in the fight for the next administration to be doing that. And you saw some of them doing that in their criticism of Steve Bannon today, one of Trump's senior advisors. And you saw Obama kind of gently framing up where people should be pushing back on principles, but not on making a snap judgment about Trump. As the president was saying, it's really only been 6 days since the election.
Very good points. All right, Mike Dorning, thank you so much for giving us your take on the president's news briefing. Mike Dorning, our White House correspondent. Let's get a recap of today's market action. Of course, we had stocks closing about 44 minutes ago. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closing at a record high. So you can see there a gain of just 21 points, but it was good enough for a new record. The S&P little changed, and the NASDAQ down by 1/3%. And Julie, one thing that's worth pointing out here when you look at equities, if you come inside the Bloomberg, is this rotation that's going on. Not just from bonds to equities, but within the equity space as well. Before the elections, technology was leading. Now it's quickly moving into the weakening quadrant over here. And financials continue to power ahead on this idea that steeper yield curve and rising interest rates will benefit that industry, along with more deregulation. Safe havens, and we're talking about utilities and staples, were starting to break out, but they've since made a U-turn and continue to lag behind.
Yeah, and what's notable to me, too, is that the Russell 2000 closed at a record today as well, so small caps continuing to outperform. You mentioned the utilities and sort of the traditional safe havens. It's because they're interest rate sensitive that they've been underperforming, of course. So if you look at the continued movement in bonds today, even though the overall macro movement in stocks sort of paused, it did not pause when it came to bonds. The sell-off continues apace, and we continue to see relatively large moves on those yields. From the two-year note, saw a move up of 9 basis points. Look at that, 1% on the two-year yield, 2.25 on the 10-year, and 3 even on the 30-year now. It's just been a remarkable move over the past week.
The speed at which it has moved has been
the velocity, incredible. To use a Tom.
There you go. Well, let's stay with that idea here, because I'm looking at the 10-year yield. Really, last week's bond rout. It's inside the Bloomberg here, and it shows no signs of letting up. This is a 10-year, so a decade-long snapshot of the 10-year yield, and the rise in yield since October, of course, reflects falling prices. And there it is. I mean, it's been pretty steep, but over the longer term, it's fairly minimal. Technical indicators such as the RSI, the Relative Strength Index, and let's pull this up here, are now indicating that this move may be overdone. It was too far, too fast. It has now climbed above 80, which is the highest since 2007. So you have to go all the way back to this red circle. Anything above this red line, by the way, indicates that yields may be overbought, or in other words, that the notes may be oversold.
Exactly. So let's talk more about inflation, about the underlying economy under a Trump presidency. And for that, let's bring in Mizuho Chief U.S. Economist Steve Rizzuto. Thanks so much for coming in, Steve.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's good to see you. I was reading over your most recent note, and one of the interesting points that you make, and this is always a good reminder for people who cover the markets, is that the markets are not the economy, right? And that was true over the past several years when we were seeing stocks rocket, even as the economy was sort of bumping along. How does that dichotomy work now?
Well, again, I think you're seeing that in terms of the bond market. What you're seeing in the bond market is less of an asset allocation trade out of bonds into stocks. You're seeing a great rotation in stocks. What you're seeing in bonds is the market discounting, hey, we have a $600 billion structural budget deficit. It may be $1 trillion by the time we're done with the fiscal policy. So what's happened is buyers have just disappeared from the marketplace. And in that position, the dealership community with very, very little inventory capabilities just walk away from the market, try to find levels that'll pull people back in, and that's why round numbers like 2.25 become technically important levels, because those are levels where they hope to find some support in the marketplace. Our numbers show it's closer to 230 that you'll find that support in the marketplace. But if you blow through that, there's an easy potential that you could walk this thing back up to 3% before you get real domestic investors in. Now, to some extent, that's a huge move. I'm not saying we're going to go there. We need to see what happens in the first 100 days, the appointments, and the actual programs they discount. So the marketplace right now, I think, is shooting first, asking questions later.
And even though, yes, we're moving up from very low levels, but we've seen this big and rapid move, does it place any constraints on a potential stimulus? I mean, are we seeing a bond vigilante kind of situation here?
It places a real constraint on the net monetary impact of anything they do. So if you go ahead and you produce a $250 billion tax cut, you go out and have $100 billion in defense spending, and you get some kind of $150 billion in infrastructure spending, however you want to structure, you get another $500 billion coming through. Maybe that could add 0.5%, you would hope. The problem is the backup in interest rates, in particular the backup in the 2-year note, then leads to a higher currency. And that higher currency and that higher interest rate environment subtract from that growth. So I'm looking at this move and the speed of the move and the velocity of the move, as you indicated, and sitting there saying, okay, maybe I get 0.25 point next year. I'm starting from 1.5% growth. So I don't really get up to a very strong economy with this environment. So if I don't get my bang for my buck, I don't have a sustainable move in the economy on the backdrop of it, because markets take a lot of that force right out of it.
So before the election, the conventional wisdom was that if Trump won the presidency, there would be a rush to safe havens. It would be recessionary. And of course, what we saw now in the last couple of days is that everyone's thinking a Trump presidency means fiscal stimulus, pro-business reforms, as well as inflation. We've moved from one extreme to the other. What nuances are investors missing here?
Well, I think what's happening in terms of the market's perceptions of everything included in here is everyone's perceptions going into the election night were dead wrong.
Correct.
And the net result is their presumption as to how markets were behaved were going to be flawed as a result of that. So you really can't use that as a comparison and say something's wrong. What the market's doing right now is saying this is going to be pro-growth. We haven't had pro-growth in 8+ years. This is a time to celebrate. And so the market starts discounting a lot, but it isn't looking at the potential negative ramifications yet. That's the second thought. That's the shoot first and ask questions later response to this whole thing. And I think that's the important point, because that will get us to where we need to be by time the first 100 days is over.
Are you adjusting any of your assumptions, your forecasts, as a result of the election?
We're basically in a process of rethinking it all ourselves, to be honest with you. The growth story is not going to be dramatic. I mean, maybe on a fourth quarter basis in 2007, because of the timing of when this stuff gets in, I can add a tenth or two. In 2018, maybe I could add a couple of tenths, maybe 0.3% to my growth numbers on the backdrop of what the interest rate environment's doing. Where I am concerned is what's happening in the 2-year note is that the market, I think, with the December FOMC meeting, is going to have to price in more in terms of monetary policy than it had been. So I don't think that sell-off in the 2-year note is complete yet.
Very interesting. Steve Buscito, thank you so much for coming in. Really interesting conversation about the ramifications of what we've seen in the markets the past few days and a Trump presidency.
All right. Meantime, while President Obama was speaking, we did get some 13F filings released. One was from Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, which disclosed stakes in American Airlines, Delta Airlines, and United Continental Holdings. Berkshire held almost 22 million shares of American as of September 30th. Shares for those companies rising by better than 4% in after-hours trading on that disclosure. Berkshire also added a stake in Southwest Airlines, according to CNBC.
And we also got a 13F filing from Carl Icahn. Among the revelations of that, he boosted his stakes in Herbalife and Hertz. He cut his stake in Allergan, exited positions in Chesapeake Energy and Transocean. Don't see a lot of stock reaction as of yet, but we will be following these filings. Don't miss, this is coming up. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Scarlett Fu. Home Depot is set to report earnings before Tuesday's U.S. opening bell. President-elect Donald Trump might give the home improvement chain a lift with a lower tax rate and increased fiscal spending, but he could also be a negative with his stance on immigration. Let's take a look at what we know right now about Home Depot in today's The Numbers Don't Lie. So the retailer has posted at least 20% growth in adjusted EPS over the past 6 years, and you can see that this fiscal year, that pace is expected to slow down a bit, but at an estimated 15%, and that is the yellow bar, we're still talking double digits. Now, driving that earnings performance is a streak of 21 straight quarters of comparable sales growth. A decline in third quarter U.S. home spending, however, could eat into these sales this time around. Home spending is critical as Home Depot's sales often correlate with the remodeling market index, which is that blue line there, which surveys remodelers on a quarterly basis by asking them how much work they're getting. Any value above that 50 line, which is a dotted yellow line, represents an increase for the index. One fly in the ointment, though, is that suppliers such as Whirlpool and the paint company Sherwin-Williams have recently seen lower demand for big-ticket categories like appliances. These kinds of purchases, which typically exceed $900, are a big deal for Home Depot. You can see how over the past 7 fiscal years, they've shown strong growth. Now, big-ticket purchases increase as Americans feel more confident in the values of their homes. The white line here tracks the bounce back in home prices since the financial crisis as supply, the orange bars, have trended lower. Now, if Home Depot sees homeowners' confidence waning, it may increase promotions into the fourth quarter. That would, of course, put pressure on gross margins. We'll be following Home Depot's earnings when the company releases them before Tuesday's U.S. opening bell. Julie?
And Scarlett, for more on Home Depot, let's now bring in Shelley Banjo. She's a columnist for Bloomberg Gadfly who looks at retail. Home Depot among the companies that you look at, of course. So the stock is still down a little bit year to date. It's down about 3.5%, although it has climbed along with consumer discretionary over the past week with the results of the election. What's your take here on where HD goes from here?
I think investors, the biggest question is this it? Is this the peak? Have we reached it? You know, this has been 5 years of so much growth for Home Depot, just completely, as Scarlett pointed out, leaving their competitors in the dust in terms of sales, in terms of profits, just keeps on growing. And so things are starting to slow down. Each quarter that happens, it gets harder for them to compare against the previous quarter. And so investors are asking, you know, is this enough? You know, is this going to slow down from here? And then you have the big macro picture. You know, what's going to happen once interest rates rise? What's going to happen once home ownership slows? The thing is, those are questions investors have been asking every quarter for the past few years because people have been saying that for quite some time now.
And it's kept going.
And it's kept going.
It's kept going. And of course, Home Depot's done well compared to its competitor Lowe's as well. Are we starting to see more macro issues that are going to take Home Depot down, or is Home Depot perhaps not pursuing the right strategy with this more mature environment?
I don't think Home Depot is going to lose share to Lowe's. I think when it comes to the macro, they're both kind of in the same boat there. Home Depot has bigger stores, more sales per square foot than Lowe's. They have a bigger professional contractor clientele. So from that perspective, they're doing a good job. The other thing Home Depot is doing way better of a job at than Lowe's is online sales. And people used to think that there was some moat around Home Depot, that they could not be touched by Amazon. And Home Depot proved otherwise. They actually increased their online sales quite a bit over the past few years.
How does inflation play into Home Depot's thesis here? Because, you know, we're seeing copper go up, for example. Oil's been fluctuating, but are prices going to go up for Home Depot customers, and then what is that going to mean for sales?
I mean, it can actually be a very good thing for a lot of retailers, especially when it comes to commodities, things that you mentioned, like copper. You're seeing the same thing with the grocery stores with food. Those types of things can raise prices for these companies and actually be a good thing, but to a point.
Gotcha. All right, Shelley Banjo, thank you so much. She's a columnist for Bloomberg Gadfly. We'll be hearing from Home Depot tomorrow morning.
And, of course, you can read all of Shelley's commentary at GADF Go on the Bloomberg. Don't forget that tomorrow you've got a lot of market-moving events coming up. We've got the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney testifying before Parliament, as well as U.S. retail sales at 8:30.
Yeah, and, of course, we've got a lot of Fed speakers, as we talked about earlier in the show. What, 17 is what someone brought up? So
Fed Go on the Bloomberg.
Yes, Fed Go has a list of all of those speakers.
All right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow evening. Tomorrow night, right? Not quite evening.
Evening. Afternoon. This is Bloomberg.
Good evening. Journalism world and the nation are deeply mourning tonight the loss of legendary reporter, TV anchor, and our friend, Gwen Ifill. She died today at the age of 61. It's a big loss. We're going to talk about Gwen Ifill's life and work throughout the program. We'll start with words this afternoon from President Obama.
Gwen was a friend of ours. She was an extraordinary journalist. She always kept faith with the fundamental responsibilities of her profession, asking tough questions, holding people in power accountable, and defending a strong and free press that makes our democracy work.
The president said it just right. We're going to talk more about Gwen throughout the program, but first we're going to start the program with what Gwen would want us to start with, the day in politics. The former UN Ambassador John Bolton's name has now been floated into the air as a possible Secretary of State, while the world is still grappling with the meaning and potential repercussions of Donald Trump's first White House staff appointments. Over the weekend, the next president filled the top two jobs of his innermost circle, naming the Republican Party chairman, Reince Priebus, as the White House chief of staff, and Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart and a firebrand figure associated with the alt-right movement, as his chief strategist and senior counselor. Both men are going to report directly to President Trump and be, according to the press release, equal partners in running the administration.
By selecting Reince Priebus, Trump is signaling that he's willing to employ some D.C. swamp dwellers with government experience, even at the highest level of the White House. But the idea of Bannon in that storied place, the White House that is, has unleashed a gush of criticism from civil rights groups, Democrats, and some Republicans who say that Bannon represents the nationalist and at times racist views that Trump should be vocally rejecting. Yesterday, the Anti-Defamation League put out a terse statement calling Bannon, quote, hostile to core American values, and the Southern Poverty Law Center called the pick a, quote, mockery of Trump's pledge to unite the country. Today, in his first press conference since the election, Barack Obama had advice for the president-elect and some tough love for critics of the team that Trump is building.
I had been encouraged by his statements on election night about the need for unity and his interest in being the president for all people. And that how he staffs, the first steps he takes, the first impressions he makes, the reset that can happen after an election, all those things are important and should be thought about. The people have spoken. Donald Trump will be the next president, the 45th president of the United States. And it will be up to him to set up a team that he thinks will serve him well and reflect his policies.
So, Mark, these two choices, obviously big news and have been dominating conversation ever since they were unveiled yesterday. Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon. Talk about the logic of that joint selection.
Well, from Trump's point of view, it's pretty obvious. These are two guys who played as big a role as anyone else in getting him elected. Two guys who are loyal to him, who he feels loyalty to, who he thinks will produce the kind of White House he wants. And the reality is, if you take the two of them and Mike Pence, take away the controversy of Bannon for a moment, it's not a bad setup. You've got three guys with the division of labor to get stuff done who Trump trusts, and Priebus is trusted on Capitol Hill. I think Bannon should speak, Trump should speak about him. By not addressing these issues head on, they're allowing him to be defined in a negative way, and rightfully so. He's got a fuller resume than just his time at Breitbart, but people are alarmed by his association with Breitbart. They're doing nothing to really address it except saying Bannon's a great guy. And I think they're creating a problem that they should address head on. If Bannon's going to be a senior government official, he needs to be accountable. And Trump needs to explain why he's willing to overlook, which he apparently is, some of the most controversial aspects of what Breitbart has done.
Well, not clear that he's overlooking them, more that he may want to embrace some of the more controversial aspects of what Breitbart has done. Look, the argument today coming out of some Republicans, which is, well, you see these incendiary headlines at Breitbart. You can't hold Steve Bannon accountable for every headline that's been on Breitbart. Yeah, you can. You really can. He didn't write those stories and he didn't write those headlines, but he ran Breitbart and proudly trumpeted the notion that Breitbart had become a home for white nationalism and the alt-right. That is by I think most people's point of view, not everyone's, but that is a toxic force in American life and certainly a divisive one. So you're picking Steve Bannon. You're sending a horrible message to large segments of this country about what kinds of attitudes and attributes you're willing to embrace close to the very most, close to the seat of power in the Oval Office. I don't know what Donald Trump could say about Steve Bannon that would make anybody not worried about him, given his history and given Breitbart's history. But certainly not saying anything. This is an incredibly controversial pick, the most controversial pick for chief of staff in our lifetime, not chief of staff, but of someone at a senior level of the White House in our lifetime. And it threatens, I think, to undermine whatever modest good Donald Trump has done so far by trying to be reassuring to people. It threatens to undermine all of that with everyone who has the worst fears and suspicions about where this administration is going to go.
And it's not just controversial with partisan Democrats or with the media. It's controversial with Republicans.
Yes.
They need to address, at a minimum, because I don't think he's going to fire him over the firestorm, obviously. They need to address the specific things, the specific headlines. He can say, I didn't write them, but he needs to address them, and he needs to repudiate them if he's going to have any hope of being part of a unifying administration. The guy, as I said, I've said it in the past, he has a fuller resume than this, but he can't hide behind that. He has to address head-on, take responsibility, explain, and denounce the things that people are rightfully really upset about. All right, so as Donald Trump tries out his new role as president-elect, he seems himself, despite the appointment of Bannon, to be toning down more than just his demeanor. During that news-packed interview he did with Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes that aired on Sunday night, Trump was asked about several policy positions he took during the campaign, and on a few, including immigration, gay marriage, and the Affordable Care Act, Trump appeared to soften his past stance.
Are you really going to build a wall?
Yes.
They're talking about a fence in the Republican Congress.
Sure.
Would you accept a fence?
For certain areas I would, but certain areas the wall is more appropriate. I'm very good at this. It's called construction. But
so part wall, part fence?
Yeah, it could be. There could be some fencing.
Let me ask you about Obamacare, which you say you're going to repeal and replace. When you replace it, are you going to make sure that people with preconditions are still covered?
Yes, because it happens to be one of the strongest assets.
You're going to keep that?
Also, with the children living with their parents for an extended period,
you're going to keep
very
that?
much try and keep that. Adds cost, but it's very much something we're going to try and keep.
Do you support marriage equality?
It's irrelevant because it was already settled. It's law. It was settled in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's done.
So even if you appoint a judge that...
It's done. You have... these cases have gone to the Supreme Court. They've been settled. And I'm fine with that.
So this isn't unfamiliar. During the presidential race, Trump walked back controversial statements and policy prescriptions at times, often claiming that he had been misunderstood or taken out of context. And in all that back and forth, it never really seemed to hurt his standing in the polls. Today, at that White House press conference, President Obama suggested that shiftiness and flexibility on policy may actually be an asset in the Oval Office.
He is coming to this office with fewer set, hard and fast policy prescriptions than a lot of other presidents might be arriving with. I don't think he is ideological. I think ultimately he's pragmatic in that way, and that can serve him well as long as he's got good people around him and he has a clear sense of direction.
So, John, Trump can go left, he can go right, but when he flip-flops, will he pay a greater price if he does it in the Oval Office than he did as a candidate?
Well, it depends on what he flip-flops on and in what direction. There are many conservatives who did not get behind Donald Trump in the course of the nomination fight in the general election because they didn't believe he was actually conservative at all, that he'd been a Democrat his whole life, that he donated to Democrats his whole life, and that on issues like health care, he was maybe even further to the left than Hillary Clinton in his heart. So one of the things we're going to find out now is how much does Donald Trump actually understand policy, and does he have, forget about ideology that the president was talking about, does he have actual beliefs of any kind about what policies he'd like to see implemented, and what are those beliefs? Because I think there's a fair number of people who think that Trump was just saying all the stuff he thought he needed to say to win the nomination and then to get elected. We're now going to find out if there's a real Donald Trump and who that person is. If he moves to the center in flip-flopping, he's not going to pay a price at all because mainstream Republicans and much of the liberal media will appreciate that if he does that.
I mean, look, if you ask me, does Donald Trump care more about what Gary Bauer thinks or Maureen Dowd thinks? I think the answer is Maureen Dowd. You know, so So the question, I think, is going to be, for on most of these issues, is going to be, does he pay a price on the right? And I think between Trump and Bannon and some of the other people, the messaging, Kellyanne Conway, they're going to figure out a way to make people feel good about what's happening, particularly economic conservatives. If they're going to pass major corporate tax reform early on, I think a lot of economic conservatives who don't care much about the social agenda that Trump ran on putatively as a candidate, they'll be like, great, and he will keep a lot of support in the Republican Party. And I don't think social conservatives, very many of them, are going to turn away because Trump will find some way to keep them happy.
Well, of course, that's the concern. When he has to throw those pieces of red meat off to keep the right happy, what are those pieces of red meat and what do they look like and how much do they scare the mainstream? Anyway, all right. The revolting hate speech and hate crimes that have been occurring across this country since the election have not abated. The Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked more than 200 incidents of, quote, election-related harassment and intimidation over the past week alone, targeting African Americans, Muslims, women, and the LGBT community. And yet, Donald Trump, the president-elect who keeps saying that he wants to unite the country, had been silent on this matter until he was asked about it in that 60 Minutes interview that aired last night.
Do you want to say anything to those people?
I would say don't do it. That's terrible, because I'm going to bring this country together.
They're harassing Latinos, Muslims.
I am so saddened to hear that, and I say stop it if it helps. I will say this, and I'll say it right to the camera, stop it.
Mark, you and I talked last week about the obligation that Donald Trump has to speak out against the acts of hate that are being carried out, in some cases in his name. Was what he said last night on 60 Minutes enough?
Really glad he did it. Nowhere near enough. And again, I know he doesn't want his transition consumed by doing play-by-play of these horrible things and responding to everyone. But this has been, he has never been Mr. Empathy. He has never been a guy who emotes and talks about these kinds of things in a way that I think the country needs right now. We said it before. It'd help him. It'd help his presidency. It'd help the country. I think he needs to talk more about it, and maybe even some of the specifics, and maybe, as some people suggested, do some symbolic event that would try to send a message that he sees this stuff happening and he doesn't approve, and he doesn't have to be asked about it. He's proactive about denouncing it.
Right. The list, we could sit here, I'm not going to do it, but you could make if you go through this list of these 200 incidents that have been recorded by the Southern Poverty Law Center, many of them are horrifying, and they are horrifying, and many of them have been carried out by people who invoke Donald Trump's name as they carry out these acts. You know, this is an unprecedented thing. We've never seen, again, anything like this in the wake of a presidential election. And I think, you know, Donald Trump saying, stop it, I'll look directly in the camera and say, stop it, is nowhere near close to the same vicinity of the same universe of enough if this guy wants to actually be the president of the United States and have the respect of more than the people who voted for him. And even some of those people who are probably troubled by what they're seeing play out across the country right now. Got to do more. It's really hard for him because, of course, he ran a divisive and in some cases racist campaign that incited and fostered a lot of this negative feeling that's now playing out across the country. Hard position, but he has got to man up and do more than he's done so far, or this is going to be an ugly, ugly, ugly transition to power for him and for the country.
The campaign's over. There's no reason I can think of to not do it. All right, up next, there's now a Democrat with an inside track on the DNC chair job. We'll talk about who that is and how he's getting to the top in a crowded field right after this. Soul-searching Democrats still trying to suss out the future of their party and the person they want to lead it. When it comes to the next leader, Bernie Sanders has thrown his weight behind the Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison. He's also got endorsements from Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren, and the outgoing Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid. Today, Ellison became an official candidate. John, there are about 4 or 5 other people eyeing it. Would Ellison, clearly the front runner now, be a good choice?
I think he'd be a good choice. I think he'd be a good choice for a couple reasons. I think, he's clearly now becoming like the unity candidate, a candidate who can get Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders on one side, Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid, who are liberal, obviously, but not like from the far progressive wing of the party. They're piling in behind him. I think the notion of an African American and a Muslim as the face of the party at this moment, of the stark contrast that he would make with Donald Trump. He's a well-spoken guy. He's smart. I think he will be potentially a really good choice for this job.
He brings a lot to it. He's a smart guy. He's principled. He's well liked. I'd question, just because I haven't seen him do it, can he raise big money? Can he go on television and at the highest levels, he's on TV all the time, but can he go on the highest levels and really take on a president? And can he be a member of Congress and also run the DNC? A lot of people like Howard Dean are saying it should be a full-time chair. So I think the guy brings a lot to it. I think he's as impressive as anybody else talking about being in the race. But there's some big question marks about, as far as I'm concerned, about whether he's ready to take that next level up and be the voice of the Democratic Party and the fundraiser for the Democratic Party.
Right. I think those are fair questions. But I got to say, this guy, as we've discussed, could potentially be the face of the Democratic Party going forward. And there will be no more powerful a vision than there's an image of a black man as the counterpoint to Donald Trump if things start to go in a nasty, racially freighted direction in this administration. Very powerful to have him speaking out.
Real quick, he's a really impressive guy.
He is
very impressive. And there's a reason why these people are coalescing around him.
All right, so we don't have that much time, so I want to get to this topic. Hillary Clinton basically said this weekend to a bunch of donors that she thinks she lost the election because of James Comey and his intervention in the campaign about 10 days out from Election Day. Mark, you think that's true?
I mean, I think it definitely played a role, and I think it riled up Republicans, maybe got some Democrats riled up too. But I think they're being way too ad hoc in how they're addressing this. There are some Democrats who are really angry that she's citing Comey as the main reason why she lost when there's so many other things that the campaign did not execute on. So what percentage of it is true, I don't know, and I think Comey shouldn't have done it, but I think they'd be smart to have a more organized response because they're leaving a bad taste in some people's mouths.
I agree with that. Did James Comey play maybe in the end, at the very end, a crucial, decisive maybe role? Yes, I think possibly. And as you know, we both agree, he shouldn't have done what he did. It was an inappropriate thing for the FBI director to do, to intervene in this election at that time. But Hillary Clinton, if she showed up with millions of fewer votes than Barack Obama got in 2012, running against a candidate with the liabilities that Donald Trump had, her inability to get the Democratic base out in big numbers, her inability to create the kind of enthusiasm that she needed to beat an eminently beatable challenger in Donald Trump. That is there are many other places to lay blame that have to do with her history, with her past, how she handled the email thing from the very beginning, how she handled it for a year and a half. There's a lot of blame to go around. Comey deserves some, but not all.
Totally agree. All right, up next, our colleague Josh Green, who's a reporter on the Bannon Beat, tell us the latest about what's going on in the Trump transition right after this. Talked earlier in the program about Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's pick for White House chief strategist, joining us now from Washington, D.C., a guy who is about the only reporter who can get Steve Bannon on the record. Bloomberg Businessweek's national correspondent, our colleague Josh Green. So, Josh, Bannon knows he's controversial. What's in it for him to take such a big job and become the lightning rod in this administration?
Well, I mean, Bannon fancies himself a revolutionary, Mark, as you know. I mean, he thinks that he is helping kind of propagate this right-wing populist movement that swept across the globe, that got Trump in the GOP nomination, and now has kind of swept him into the White House. So I think Bannon views himself as Trump's Karl Rove. And so it's only appropriate that now that Trump is in the Oval Office, that Bannon will be right there with him, advising him on strategy.
So is he doing it because he's loyal to Trump? Is he doing it because he wants to change America? Is he doing it because it's a fun and interesting job? What's the mix of motivations, as best you can tell?
I haven't talked about the motivations, but I strongly suspect it's all three of those. I mean, if you look at what Breitbart News has done over the last few years, they've tried to lead this revolution in the Republican Party and drive out the old guard and bring in new people like Trump, and they basically succeeded in doing that. So I think that what Bannon sees himself as doing is, formalizing that victory by taking a powerful role in a White House so that he can steer the country and help President Trump realize the vision for a different kind of governing agenda than anything we've seen from Republicans or Democrats in the past.
Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Not only have you gotten Bannon on the record repeatedly, but you wrote a long profile of him a little while ago, maybe a year ago or so, maybe a little longer. A lot of the things that the critics of this move are saying is that Steve Bannon's a racist, Steve Bannon's an anti-Semite, that Breitbart is a reflection of those flaws in his character and personality. Is he a racist? Is he an anti-Semite?
I mean, as George Bush said of Vladimir Putin, I can't look into his soul. Maybe I have that backwards. Maybe Bush could look into his soul. I can't look into Bannon's soul. He is a guy who went to Harvard Business School. He was a Goldman Sachs banker. He isn't some knuckle-dragging rube from the backcountry. But on the other hand, he is the chief executive of Breitbart News, which publishes articles that are intentionally inflammatory, that are racially charged, that certainly propagate a lot of racist and anti-Semitic themes, and that is far, far outside the bounds of anything we've seen in mainstream American politics before. And I think what that really does is speak to the fact that Trump, as a presidential candidate and now a president, is so far outside the bounds of anything we've ever seen before. Hard to imagine a guy like Trump being elected, but he has been. Right. And the fact that he has been is in there now. It's really not that surprising that he would surround himself with people like Steve Bannon.
Right. So he's been appointed along with Reince Priebus, who's now going to be the chief of staff. One thing we know about Bannon is that he has often talked about his desire to exact retribution and undermine Paul Ryan and the Republican establishment as much as anything else. So if you're sitting up on Capitol Hill, you're happy about Reince Priebus, but what are you thinking if you're Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell about Steve Bannon and his agenda with respect to the Republican establishment?
Well, I imagine you're pretty nervous. And if you look at the balance of power in the Trump campaign, Bannon, I think, was more of an architect than Priebus was when it came to steering Trump toward an agenda. I mean, I think the two of them worked well together. Bannon has always claimed that they have, and Priebus has always claimed that they have, too. But let's be blunt. I mean, Priebus took essentially a subordinate position to Trump from the moment he became the nominee. That continued throughout the campaign, and my expectation, I guess, would be that that would probably continue in the White House, too, at least until Trump runs into some kind of trouble and feels the need to shake things up.
Josh, what is likely to be the role, a lot of speculation about today, of Breitbart in the Trump administration?
I think that's an open question. And when you stop and think about it, it's a little difficult, I think, for Breitbart to navigate the new terrain in Washington. They have always happily and gleefully been outsiders throwing rocks at the Republican and the Democratic establishment, led by Steve Bannon. And now the fact that Bannon is in there in the White House with the Breitbart candidate and Donald Trump is going to make it much harder, I think, to play that same kind of role, especially if Trump does what he says he intends to do and governs in a way that includes establishment Republicans and even Democrats. It'll be interesting to see whether they wind up playing the same role they have in the past, or whether it's some kind of watered-down version of Pravda.
All right, Josh Green, thanks very much. You can read Josh's latest story on our website at BloombergPolitics.com or in Bloomberg Business Week. We'll be right back.
Joining us now on set is the Democratic strategist and former congressman from Tennessee, Harold Ford Jr. And in our Washington, D.C. bureau, we have the political strategist and I believe still a member, registered independent, or registered libertarian, I believe, Mary Madeline. Great to see you, Mary. I'm going to start with you, ask you this question. How do you think at this moment the president-elect is doing?
I think he's doing great. I mean, what do we have to judge it by? 60 Minutes? I think he made a good decision on Reince as chief of staff, and it's in the Andy Card mold of making the trains run on time. And Reince is particularly connected to Ryan and a very successful governor. Scott Walker, Reince is from the heartland, so he gets the whole Rust Belt, and he's seen successful policies prosecuted in Wisconsin by Scott Walker. So that's good, and I think Steve, I don't know him, but I think he's also a good selection. And from what I hear, the rest is on the list, and I know the court list. Let's go. Let's go make America great again.
Harold, what do you think? There's obviously been a huge outcry about the notion of Steve Bannon, given his pedigree, given the Breitbart's role in coarsening our national political discourse, and in the particular way it has. What do you think about that as a choice, and whether it's unnecessarily provocative?
I would agree with Mary's appraisal thus far. I think as it relates to Mr. Bannon, he's going to have to prove himself. There's no doubt there's a history there with some baggage. This is not Democrats making this up. These are former employees and deputies of his at Breitbart making some of these declarations and even accusations about the company. But I think overall, I mean, I'm disappointed my candidate did not win. I think it behooves President-elect Trump to make clear again, as many times as he can, he wants to represent and serve all the people. It'd probably be good for him at some point to make clear to the country that things that happened during the campaign were things that happened during the campaign, and people should not interpret him as representing that. And he calls on those who are practicing some of these things in his name, calls on them to stop, and then gets on to governing. And again, they've got to prove themselves, and I'm willing to give them a chance to do that.
Guys, as controversial as Bannon has been, if John Bolton really becomes a Secretary of State, it'd be controversial for a lot of people, too. Harold, you first. What would your reaction be if that happened?
Well, I think at that point, I was at church over the weekend, and my pastor was trying to caution people, saying, look, right now we know more about what Donald Trump is against than what he's for, and hopefully we'll find out here in the near term. And if indeed the Bolton choice is made, I think that begins to raise even more concerns as it relates to policy and America's posture around the globe. So I would find that disconcerting. I hope that is not the case. I hope that the 60 Minutes interview and the temperament and tone that he projected there, I understand he's going to pick people that not necessarily in my camp, but I certainly want people who not only want to make America great again, but put America first and understand America's role in the world should not always be to insert and to be an interventionist, but to be smart about how we go about doing things.
Mary, I'm hearing Bolton. I'm also hearing Rudy Giuliani as a possible Secretary of State. What do you think of the merits of those two options?
Well, obviously, I love them. Let me say something about Bannon, whom we think we know a lot about his personal history, but what we really need to focus on is his political